Hello friends, today we're back to cover the second video on why we should be cautious when we glorify malefics. Or at least if we do, we should be aware of what we're seeking and what we're glorifying. Because glorifying malefics can easily become a case of be careful what you ask for. In the first episode that I did for this series, I covered the implications in idealizing, glorifying, over-worshipping Saturn. I'll link that video to the description box below if you guys are interested and want to check it out. And I'll be back in this series to also cover Rahu and Ketu. And I explained this in the Saturn video. I'm doing these videos because through my astrological journey and through my own personal life, there's been instances where I see other people, and I've done it myself, glorifying one of these malefics. And we see this in statements such as, I love Mars, I love Saturn, or I love Ketu. We just constantly bring them up as if we're doing a mantra. And we have to be careful because these are malefic planets. And there's a paradox. It's like sometimes we need more Saturn, or sometimes we need more Mars in our lives. When we ourselves are grappling with some seriously brutal life themes, where those themes are malefic in themselves. But sometimes we don't realize we don't actually need the malefics to resolve our problems. And we don't realize that when we glorify or idealize these malefics, we're actually summoning their quality within our own psyche and within our own lives. A lot of time, the solution to the malefic problems of our lives is to actually gravitate towards the benefics. This is kind of like you're going through a hardship in life and it feels like you got a burn, a severe burn. And instead of putting some cooling agent, some aloe vera on it, by bringing in the malefics is like putting battery acid on top of it. And I would also argue that we gravitate towards these malefics because we don't truly understand their function and their inherent nature and what they're trying to do. And when we don't, we tend to idealize them in isolation and not understanding that we constantly have to mix and meld these malefics with the benefics to actually get very sound results in life. So these are some of the topics that we're going to discuss, and the way that I'm going to go about this video, it's going to be a little bit more philosophical at the beginning because I want to talk about Mars in terms of Mars's function and nature of existence and how we as existing entities are an iteration in existence. And we have these malefics within our own drives. So it's going to be a little bit more philosophical, and then I'm going to focus on when we do actually have too much Mars, because some of us come with extra determination, extra competitiveness. So we're going to be looking at that too. And before getting into all of it, if you find the content of this video or this channel something of value to you, please remember to like, subscribe, and share, and always comment. Your comments are actually, I say this often, makes this process, what I'm doing, personal. I don't feel like I'm talking to the void. There's a part of me that would do it anyway because I love writing and I love this creative process. But to have that feedback from you guys is contributing to my growth. I'm learning from you guys and I think we can learn from each other. That's why I emphasize on the comments. And if you guys want to your own chart reading or to know more about my classes, you can go to parisayazdi.com, or all the links are in the description box below. And this video is timestamped, so if you guys want to skip some parts or go back and forth, review, you can do that. And without further ado, let us begin. I'm going to start by going through the root meaning of malefic and benefic for some context. I did this in the Saturn video as well. I'm going to make it a little bit more condensed here, but I feel it's super important we do this so that we understand what we're talking about linguistically and in the system of astrology. So let's start with the word malefic. Strange one, right? When you come across it first, you're like, malefic. Don't they mean maleficent? What is malefic? And yes, the term comes from maleficent. And that word is referring to actions that cause harm or destruction, or things that generally have harmful influence. And the etymology of maleficent traces back to the Latin word maleficentia, and this word means doing evil. So it's important to note right off the get-go that the word malefic as a shorthand for maleficent refers to harmful actions, actions that lead to real detrimental effects. And when we examine the action of malefic planets such as Mars, the word itself is telling us that Mars has a malevolent nature. And malevolent here is referring to that which harbors the desire to harm others through harsh or even ill will. So we can see even the word malefic, at least where we stand as human beings, are not qualities that we want in our lives. However, sometimes we have to use these qualities against other malevolent things and harshness and cruelness in life. But is that really something that we want to embody? So that's a question I'll pose here at this moment. Now let's go to the word benefic, just as a contrast. So the word benefic is derived from the word beneficent, and they're describing actions that are performed out of kindness, charity, and actions that ultimately produce some good. So they're referring to actions that have positive outcomes and results. It's related to deeds that are of goodness and kindness. So the distinction that we have to remember, benefic planets in general are referring to performing good deeds and having good results, good outcomes, while the malefic planets are referring to performing harmful actions that result in negative outcomes. Their impact is generally harsh and cruel, and that's how they behave. So when we consider these definitions, we have to ask ourselves, why are we gravitating towards malefic planets? Why do we feel a sense of resonance and reverence for that which wants to cause harm, that which is cruel and harsh? And I think the way to approach that in a non-judgmental way is to actually look at where we are in life. What kind of themes are we dealing with? As well as taking a step back and having an honest look at our own psyche and its own wiring. That's what's going to allow us to see why there is a resonance and what we're seeking from this resonance. The point is, it's good for us to understand why there is a strong affinity to the malefic planets. And there's another thing worth saying, that no matter how good we think we are, we all have that malevolent nature within us. You know, people like to pose that question, are we born good or bad? I would say both. And since we do have these malevolent nature within us, and sometimes, as I was saying earlier, they actually need to come out because we need to deal with some harsh aspect of life. And sometimes they've been repressed so deep, so far away from the surface that we can't summon it. And we get hurt by the malevolent nature of life and certain circumstances that we find ourselves in. So it's actually very good to understand all of these dynamics. But our psychology aside, our nature and nurture aside, one of the things that I'm always bringing up in many of the videos that I've done, that these planets are symbolically representing some functional aspect of existence itself. This is where we're going to get into that philosophical part. These are functions that actually make existence in its existing form possible. This was the beauty of the ancients and how they could understand the world around them. So a planet like Mars, Saturn, Rahu, Ketu, as well as the benefics, are operationalizing existence. And as I was saying, we are existing entities. So a iteration of existence. So those same forces, functions exist within us. They've been reiterated as part of our own makeup. We actually need these forces, these drives within, to be these conscious entities, to be able to do what we do. It's saying something about who we have become and who we are becoming. So let's dig a little bit deeper under the symbolism of Mars to understand what the function of Mars is, what Mars is symbolizing from that existential sense. And I've wrecked my brain on trying to conceptualize this in words in some way to understand it. It's very difficult. And the way that I've come to describe this is that Mars in itself is representing motion. And we could say motion is one of the most basic, fundamental, primordial, and even primitive principle that operationalizes existence. That means motion is the means for existence to come into its existing form, to exist. So in some ways, this makes Mars one of the most primitive force and drives in existence. Mars as motion becomes the principle behind all movement. It's essentially what animates existence from that stillness, that initial condition prior to the Big Bang, the so-called nothingness. It is motion that brings it into somethingness. To get a little bit poetic, because we have to, because we're talking in such great degree of abstraction, we could conceptualize Mars as a force that stirred that initial silence prior to existence coming into existence. Like even when we go to the ancient texts from different cultures in the world and going, let's say, back to India and to the Vedic traditions, existence itself is conceptualized as a kind of a consciousness. And what represents that is the sun. So that initial first stirring that was needed, it needed a force like Mars. And when we go back to that tradition, we have another force, which is called Shiva. And Shiva and Mars have similarities. We don't want to talk about the ranking, but in terms of function. And in the same tradition, in some of the narratives, Shiva is the father of Mangala, of Mars. In other ones, Vishnu is in one of its avatar forms, but that's a discussion for another day. The point here is that Mars is not just movement the way like I can pick up this cloth. The energy that I just exerted to do that is not just about that movement. There's something deeper and more fundamental, which is motion itself, which allows these things to occur. We could say Mars is the motion within consciousness itself. It's the motion that permits movements, the energy that permits movement. And what does movement do? Like one of the symbols for Mars is to sever and to cut. Because what moves this cloth from being here, by me moving it here, I just severed it from its previous location. And through that severing act, movement is permitted. And what's the function of, let's say, consciousness? We're constantly trying to pay attention to something. And as I give you my attention's cut from everything else. The minute I refocus my attention, I've been severed from this moment. So Mars is involved, like underneath all of it. It's what allows the previous state to be the previous state and for the preceding state to come forth. In the Zen tradition, they talk about existence as a kind of emotion. Everything's always changing. In some ways, we can go beyond conceptualizing Mars as a character in a story, the hero in a story who's acting. In itself is the force that pushes the story forward. To move, it's what makes movement be possible in the first place. It's like that initial condition of existence. First, there was nothing. And then there had to be some sort of a motion where that motion becomes propulsion, momentum, and then we get the outward expansion from that silent interiority, which is also the feminine principle, and Mars is considered a hyper-masculine principle. The trajectory of existence, universe, as something that is expanding and growing outwards becomes possible. We can see Mars as being about energy or being energy. It's the energy that necessitates movement, action. And we got to remember, Mars has been associated to the concept of dharma, doing the right actions. And dharma, I would argue, would only pertain to conscious beings, those beings who can direct their energy, their motion, movement, action. And I want us to think about this from an astrological perspective. Who's Mars's best friend? Is the sun. Mars is at the service of the sun. And the sun symbolizes consciousness, the soul, the self, the mover. And then think about where the sun exalts. It exalts in the sign of Mars, in the sign of Aries. And as I was saying, the sun itself is the symbol for the Godhead, for the ultimate being. It's a representation of that being. And for me, through all my thinking process, it's like this intimate connection that exists between Mars and Sun is because it is talking about that initial motion that sets consciousness to the trajectory of its becoming, which is existence itself, the all. That motion was required for consciousness to become consciousness. And for us too, wherever we are in life, we are conscious in terms of what we're conscious of, what we're aware of, to the degree that we have acted and experienced life. We have observed life, we have moved through life, and through those experiences, we have gotten a certain degree of consciousness. And based on our future actions, we become conscious in a different way. And another example of this, the relationship between Mars and that initial condition existence itself, we can see it in astrology. In the Thema Mundi chart, I'll put it up here on the side. And this is essentially, it's used as a teaching tool for astrology because it's showing us the rules of the game, the way this chart is set up. However, it's also conceptualized as the chart of existence. And I want you to pay attention to the fifth house. Mars' sign, the sign of Scorpio is there with Mars in the sign of Scorpio. So we have Mars in the most tenacious sign, in the most creative house. In a sense, having Mars in Scorpio in the fifth house, it's saying something about operationalizing the interiority of existence, setting it up so it can start its outward expansion and movement. And I've spent 5 years writing about this chart and this very concept. And I hope I get the opportunity to make a video one day if there's enough interest and I refine my own wording and language a little bit more. And even when we go to the Big Bang concept, that initial motion and propulsion, the initiation, the onset, like the sign of Aries, just going from Pisces, from potentiality to actuality, initiating life into life. We can see it there too, where existence comes into existence through energy and motion, which is, I'm arguing, is the core principle behind what Mars is and what Mars is symbolizing. Mars is the way to go from the preceding state to the proceeding state, about changing states. It's the means to move through, to move outwards. It's the means to animate because of that motion. So now these minutes have gone by, you might be asking, like, why the hell are you mentioning all of this in an astrology video? Because I think it's important to understand that these symbols, these planets and their symbolism is not just describing mundane and trivial passing events or just our psychology. And it's also important to understand that in themselves, as existential functions, they are value-free. They are what permit existence to be in its existing state. And I was describing that in the Saturn video. Saturn is a force that's controlling entropy through its restrictive and negating force. So it's at the service of existence, beyond how we experience it as hardships, limitations, as cruelty and harshness. All of the malefics is what allow existence to remain in existence. And when we pay attention to mythologies of these planets, I'll talk about this with Rahu and Ketu specifically. Why did Vishnu behead them? Why did he throw one of them on one end of the universe and another on the other? These stories go deep. But now let's go from the more philosophical, abstract discussion about what these planets symbolize, what Mars symbolizes here, to our psychological realm. So we're going to come down one notch down to Earth. And again, I have to make clear how I conceptualize the psychological component of the planets, because it's open to interpretation. And in my opinion, all the 7 traditional planets are part of our innate drive. So I'm saying there are 7 drives within us that must work in concert with equilibrium, with balance, in relation for us to have a healthy psyche. And when there's a gravitation towards one drive, we are actually talking about dysfunctionality of the psyche. Or at least we're talking about some internal lacks and gaps related to all the other drive, or the drive that we're actually hyper-focusing on. Like, I love Mars. Mars is the, in a sense, we can't be functional by operating through one drive. And we've chosen Mars, let's say, we want to just go with that. We just want to be this Martian force in the world. And I do want to say this, if we were meant to operate on one drive, we would have only had one drive. And I say that because nature is super efficient. And because of that efficiency, it would have endowed us with only one drive. But it has endowed us with 7 drives. Like, for example, Jupiter is the drive to expand, to grow. And we all have that. Venus is the drive to connect, to love, to harmonize. Mercury is our drive to know, to communicate, to establish relationship. They're all drives. And I would say Sun and Moon are actually talking about the container of this drive. Again, another topic for another video. I don't want to make this video too long. And what I'm trying to argue here is that when there's focus on one and there's neglect of the 6 other drives, we're talking about a human being who's grappling with a lot of inner shadows, dysfunctionalities, lacks, gaps, and that's going to be what we're going to be discussing from here forth. So I want to start this next section with talking about how we get this gravitation towards Mars, wanting more of Mars' symbolism, glorifying, idealizing, worshiping Mars, when there are certain inadequacies within us that we're trying to compensate or overcompensate by summoning Mars, or that drive within us. So I'm going to go through these points quickly. So the first point I want to talk about, where Mars becomes a significant drive that we focus on, or if we're into astrology, we begin to glorify Mars. It's coming from a place where we need to overcompensate, where there are self-deficiencies. For example, Mars represents the masculine principle, hypermasculine. The sun is too, but Mars represents hypermasculine, which is about being inceptive, initiating, and purely outward moving. It doesn't hold anything like the sun. The sun's more mature in its masculine definition. Mars is about energy, ambition, passion, strength. willpower, bravery, self-reliance, independence, individuality. This is what makes it hyper-masculine. It's not considering things in the periphery where the sun does. The sun is the ruler, is the king. It has to care about the kingdom. Mars does not. And we can say lack of qualities that I just stated about Mars, such as initiation, passion, ambition, when we lack these, when there's a deficiency in us, because we need these qualities, they create dysfunctions within us, and we feel that we need to overcompensate or we need to compensate by hyper-focusing on what Mars is about, and rightfully so, because that's what Mars represents. So as we can see, fair enough that we want to glorify Mars and that we want to summon Mars, because no one enjoys being in a state of stagnation or feeling passive, because that means we're unable to change our circumstances in life. So yes, in some instances, we need to strengthen this drive within us, this Martian drive. And in reality, such individuals, or when we do this, it's coming from our desire to create change, to depart from the previous state and to arrive to the next state of being. It's our desire to want to initiate, ignite, start something, to move something, or to control something, because sometimes we feel like our lives are just out of control. It's like we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough animation within us to animate the world around us. And for other people, they do this because they don't want to lose control. And the problem truly comes when these problems are left unmet. So this glorification of Mars becomes more intense and more intense. And we've got to realize when we put all of our attention on one of the drives, what it's doing in turn is it's constantly showing us our inadequacy, making us feel inadequate. And if we pay attention, this glorification of Mars is stemming from the fear of not being enough a lot of times, not doing enough, fear of not getting, attaining, achieving. It's even fear of regret that I didn't do all of these things. Sometimes we're doing enough. This is the point that I'm trying to make. Sometimes we are courageous enough. But when we start to glorify Mars, even the things that we do, where we fall short becomes hyper accentuated. That Mars's harshness and cruelty is coming in that way. Sometimes we need a little bit of moon in this case to comfort us and to be like, all right, you did your best. It's all good. But overemphasis on these drives creates what's related to Mars, which is that fight or flight feeling. So we're constantly fighting ourselves, just doing this battle of upclimb, battle of I haven't done enough, I'm not good enough, my days are going by and I haven't acted enough. And if you were to actually do some sort of statistical analysis, you're doing as much as anyone else. But it's your overemphasis in your own psychology on that one drive that is creating these kinds of thoughts and feelings. And this can actually create a feeling of overwhelm, where it also brings that freeze response, that state of paralysis, like I can't act. So this is where we need to be balanced. This is where, when we're glorifying Mars, we have to understand from which part of our psyche is it coming from, and is it actually remedying it, or is it making the situation a hell of a lot more worse? Now, I want to go and talk about the inverse of this problem. So not from wanting to glorify and idealize Mars from a place of lack or gap, but because we actually have an overdeveloped drive when it comes to Mars. And when one drive is overdeveloped, I don't care if it's Jupiter, Moon, Mars, Saturn, whatever it is, that drive is going to be overriding all the other drives, because that's what we rely on. That's where we're strong. That's where our competency is coming from. So it often comes at the cost and neglect of nurturing other drives, strengthening them. And that comes with its own price. And as I mentioned earlier, if one drive is not balanced with the other ones, the outcome is usually, in the long run of life, a metaphorical hell for themselves or for people around them, especially with a malefic like Saturn or Mars. So even those people who have cultivated that Martian drive within them, whether by nature or nurture or both, such as being inceptive, ambitious, passionate, strong, brave, self-reliant, independent, they cannot be amplified without moderation of other planets, because the outcome of it will eventually turn malefic. And that's what I want to describe right now and explain. For example, an overdeveloped Martian drive within us in the long run of life can lead to burnout and exhaustion. because we're finite beings, even though the drive is overdeveloped. For example, you can see this in people who are, let's say, workaholics. They will push and push at the expense of all the relationship, at the expense of self-care. They don't rest enough. And eventually the body, which the moon represents, will get burnt out. There will be physical exhaustion, mental, emotional, social exhaustion. Another thing that can happen is that over-reliance on Mars and its glorification leads to an outcome that we can call arrogance and isolation. Because what does Mars represent? Self-reliance. And is the most individualistic and self-oriented planet. So it's about self-reliance on oneself, extreme independence. So the person is often rejecting collaboration with other people, cooperation, support. Any kind of an input from someone else is just rejected. And when this fosters arrogance over time. This is a person who says, I know best, I do the best job, and then I might as well do it myself, which again leading to that burnout, because no one can do it better than me anyway. I'm the best at it, might as well do it. It's the inability to delegate and share. And it becomes about control issues also, right? That's where the arrogance is coming from. I know best, I do it best, stay out of my way. There's a sense of control there too. And this will leave anyone in a state of isolation over time. It alienates other people, and it eventually alienates the individual who's glorifying Mars and who's just relying on this one drive. And as I've mentioned, Mars is about severing, cutting. It's about departures. So it's inherently about exclusion of other people, exclusion of other things. It's not about inclusion. All of it which further alienates the person, leading to greater isolation. And that individualistic meaning that's attached to Mars, this is one of the outcomes that it can have. To state one of the obvious pointers in terms of outcomes that can come from this overemphasis on Mars is being reckless and impulsive. This is a speedy planet. It does everything very fast. And taking that individualistic thing that I do it myself and I do it better. It's talking about a sense of overconfident, someone who's overassured of their own decision making, for instance. And a lot of times these could be very cocky decision making, risky behavior. We can call it passion without caution. So we get impulsive decision making and disregard for consequences. And we got to remember Mars represents bravery, that part of us. That's what the drive is representing. So it's like, I'm brave to do it. I'm not scared. I'm not fearful. So these kinds of actions can be very harmful in the long run of life to the person and to people around them. To state another obvious, one of the outcomes of over-reliance on Mars can lead to excessive aggression and domination. Like the strength and the willpower that's in Mars can manifest as an overpowering need to control other people and the environment aggressively. Assertiveness turns into aggression. Now, we need sun for assertiveness. Without the sun, we just have aggression here again. It's about imposing one's will on someone else. And usually imposing your will on someone else is the perfect ingredient to escalate conflict to a degree where mutual respect is completely lost. It's a sure way of damaging most of our relationships in this way. And we have to remember Mars represents violence. And it's usually this kind of aggression and domination is what other people find violating. It's violating their sense of autonomy and their sense of personhood. And it's kind of funny, people who summon and glorify Mars, when you look at their relational dynamics, there's a lot of hostility. And then they often don't understand why the world is hostile to them. It's hard for other people to express their personhood when someone is harsh and aggressive all the time. It puts other people in a fight mode, unless if they are very enlightened. People will fight you when they feel like their sense of dignity, personhood, integrity are being violated. So people who have this overemphasis on this Martian drive evoke these feelings in other people too, and their social dynamics are colored by aggression. Another thing that can come from Mars is very high egocentric behavior, even though the ego belongs to the symbols of the sun. But in the case of Mars, it becomes egocentric because it's hyper-individualistic. It's extremely about itself. So this causes egocentric behavior and actions. And this means that we have people who prioritize their own needs and their own wants and what I say over everyone else. All that matters is their own desires, no one else's. So when we think about it, this is the inability to practice empathy and compassion, is the inability to cooperate. And again, it's worth remembering that this is another sure way of leading us to isolation and feeling alienated. Again, bringing that individualistic meaning of Mars into the forefront, which has a negative connotation. Like people who overemphasize Mars, if you pay attention to their life, they'll even sometimes praise this. I'm a lone wolf. And frankly, wolves are not meant to be alone. They're a pack animal, so it doesn't have a good meaning. Like the worst case scenario, I'm a proud lone wolf. In worst case scenario, we can find people who are feeling lonely when you dig deep within them. This is what Mars's archetype, that drive within us, does when there's an overemphasis on it. Another outcome that we can get from this overemphasis and glorification of Mars is lack of vulnerability and massive emotional disconnect. And again, this is stemming out of that aspect of Mars that it's independent. I'm strong. I don't need anyone else. I'll do it myself. So it doesn't allow one to acknowledge their vulnerability. It doesn't let them see how they need help. It doesn't allow them to ask for help. So there's an emotional detachment from, there's a part of us as human beings that grow through achievement and attainment. But there's another part of us that allows us to grow as human beings because we make ourselves emotionally vulnerable to other people and we're able to connect with them. That connection is what makes us grow. Intimate relationship make us grow. Like we live in a society where everyone wants to emphasize this notion of self-love, like is the be-all and end-all. That's just the start. When you have self-acceptance, the next step of even greater growth is to love others. And in loving others, still maintaining that sense of self-love while loving another. We need to interact with other people. That's such a huge part of our growth process. So in a sense, people who have this overemphasis on that Martian drive, and I don't want to make myself emotionally vulnerable, there's like an arrested development in them when it comes to the kind of growth that requires other people. In a lot of ways, this kind of emotional disconnect is making us weaker, not stronger. In the long run of life is rendering us helpless, not stronger. It's an illusion to think that we're strong alone and solely by ourselves. And I say this often in a number of videos. This is because we are social beings. We have our strength in our collective power. Individually, we are not that smart, but collectively, we can do quantum physics, send rockets to outer space, create the internet. I don't even know how I'm talking with you, but based on that collective knowledge that we have, here we are. You're watching me, I'm talking and hoping eventually there's a recipient of this through the airwaves, through electricity. So to be by oneself and to be isolated because you're emotionally detached, your growth is getting stunted. And there's another thing to remember, that overemphasizing on Mars, we're overemphasizing on that hyper-masculine quality of Mars, which is inceptive, initiating. So it's always moving outwards. It has no capacity for receptivity, which is the feminine principle. And if you are always moving this way and you have zero ability to be receptive and to receive, it's saying something about us being unempathetic. It's saying something about us being insensitive. Because if I want to tell you what to do, how things are done, constantly initiating, constantly pushing you, pushing myself, I'm leaving zero room to be able to receive you. How do you feel? What do you need? What do you desire? And when we don't have that sense of empathy and that emotional vulnerability, in our psychological term, we call that person a psychopath. And psychopaths are represented by Mars. And I will be talking about this once I continue the other series about narcissism in astrology. We've gone up to Venus. Mars is related to psychopathy. And in that cluster B where psychopathy is, we're talking about Mars. But I'll leave that for that video. Another thing that comes as a result of this overemphasis on Mars and that Martian quality within, or wanting to summon Mars and over-glorifying it, is to have an outcome or outcomes that are related to conflict and even violence. And this is because when Mars is the sole drive, the one that's focused on, the one that's overdeveloped, can lead to excessive competitiveness, as an example. It has an unyielding behavior, behaviors that usually lead to conflict. It thrives on opposition. It thrives on conflict in general. It loves haters. Bring me more haters, that motivates me. That's the kind of mentality that you get. And if you think about it, such individuals are usually very intimidating also. They're abrasive, unapproachable. So you can see the outcome is to, again, harm your social relationship, your relational dynamics, whether it's personal or in your professional life. People can only put up with a competitive person to a certain point. Competition is healthy insofar as your opposition is making you aware of how you can become a better person, because they're making you strive, they're activating you in a productive way. Unhealthy competition is when it becomes a zero-sum game. And people who overemphasize on this Mars quality, life is a zero-sum game. They become destructive. They have to destroy you in order to be someone, in order to get somewhere. No one wants to be around such people. They're devastating. They're exhausting. They're life-denying, life-destroying. Just to think about everything that I just said, these are very extreme of Mars's archetype. And they tend to play themselves out in extreme ways because we're just hyper-focused on that one drive that is Martian. It's being employed more than any other drive and over all the other ones. So Mars's drive is left unchecked and unbalanced. And usually to balance them out is to bring a Saturn in, actually, to bring the sun in, and specifically to bring in the benefics. And going back to the etymology of the word malefic, such individuals become harmful to themselves and to other people. This drive, when there's an over-focus on it, when we glorify those Martian qualities, the actions and the outcome are generally malefic in the long run of life. And the point that I'm trying to make by going through each one of these single points is that all the drives need to be integrated. Mars needs to be integrated. That Mars drive needs to be integrated with the other six. That's the way to have a balanced psyche. That's the way to have a balanced life, balanced social dynamics. And when there's integration, not only there is balance, but we have a healthy sense of self-restraint. So it's not about suppression, repression. We don't get to these fight, flight, freeze kind of responses. And then we don't need to go through procrastination and stagnation and then pull ourselves again, just draining it's draining modes of living. And it's usually through a lot of self-awareness that we can mitigate the destructive potential inherent in a purely Mars drive or in a Martian dominant nature. Integration is the only way to temper Mars's malevolent tendencies. If we overemphasize on Mars, we become a liability because we will produce results that are injurious. We become harsh. We become cruel. We become malefic. This is what I was trying to say, is that this is why it's important to understand what Mars is as a function that is within us, not to shun it, not to not want to have those Martian qualities, but to claim it in a balanced way, because we do need Mars, but not to an extent that we become life-destroying, destroy other people's lives, our own lives. Again, going back to that psychotic trait, ambition and passion allow us to achieve our goals, but being solely goal-oriented, not wanting to cooperate with other people, makes us psychotic. It's a sure way of leaving people around us feeling used and abused. This is the way to miss the point of what achievements are about. Essentially, whatever it is that we're achieving, the deepest psychological background that's thriving to achieve something is to get us more deeply rooted into life, which is often about other people. It is about inclusion of things, inclusion of people. Mars by itself cuts and severs. It achieves at the expense of other people. Someone who glorifies Mars misses the mark because they want to achieve out of gratification, personal self-gratification in an individualistic way, and even at the expense of others. So they miss the mark. So when we overemphasize on Mars, we have to be prepared to feel a lot of isolation, to feel disconnected, and to sever ourselves from a meaningful sense of existing in our life. For us, again, as social being, meaning comes from inclusion, from cooperation, from having strong bonds. Mars is bound to render us feeling very unfulfilled in the long run of life if there's an overemphasis on it. Hence why we need to be diligent about understanding at least why we're glorifying Mars. All of that said, I do want to talk about how and when Mars yields great outcomes, positive outcomes. Again, the positive outcomes come when there's an integration with all the other drives, all the other planets. And when we're able to do that, we'll see that energy requires rest as a basic example. That's the way to sustain ourselves. That's the way to keep going, to keep achieving, to keep showing up. When we bring in the other planets, we'll see that ambition actually needs reflection. It requires introspection. That's what aligns us to meaningful goals. That's what gives us a sense of purpose. When we bring in the other drives, we can achieve, but not at the cost and the expense of others, because most of our achieving in life, even if we want to look at it from a self-oriented way, requires the help and support of other people. So how long and how much can you alienate and exclude other people till no one supports you in your endeavors, which equates to failure eventually? Bringing in the other planet shows us that passion actually needs temperance. That's the way to avoid impulsivity. As I was explaining before, strength is actually enhanced through empathy, through vulnerability, through inclusion of other people. And independence actually thrives when it's balanced with interdependence. When we're able to integrate in this way and bring in all the drives, all the planets, all the symbols, we can channel all of their energy constructively. They come to support our growth, our becoming process. They actually create a sense of beauty in life, a life that feels whole, worth living, meaningful, purposeful. And when we have a Mars that's integrated, not overemphasized, not just taken out and just overdeveloped at the expense of all other ones, when we have a Mars that can integrate in that manner, we understand what Dharma is. We understand what we're made of, that inherent motion within that's trying to initiate and come into existence and to denote the process of being and becoming. We also, within the human realm, become moral. We do the right things by ourselves and by other people. We become purposeful. We, in general, become the protector of life rather than the destroyer of life. Mars by itself will inevitably lead to destruction because inherently, as I was describing initially, yes, Mars will spark, ignite. But from there forth, Mars is the motion that keeps moving. So it's constantly departing from previous states, and it's going to the preceding states and the next and the next. So that constant act of departure is an act of destroying what was previously there. We got to know where we're going along the way, what we're connecting with. We got to know what to protect. So a functional Mars is actually not just the hero, but he is the savior, the protector. So an integrated Mars actually protects life rather than destroy life. So in conclusion, we can say to exalt Mars without temperance and without balancing its qualities with the other planets and the other 6 drives, we risk embodying the extremes of Mars. And I'm talking about exaltation, this just came to mind. It's worth remembering where Mars is exalted, right? Mars is exalted in the sign of Capricorn, and that's Saturn's sign, Mars' enemy. But that's a sign that symbolizes structures. Discipline is a sign that imposes limits. And it's saying something, saying a vital truth about what Mars needs to be functional. That is, Mars can only wield its power constructively when it operates within a framework where there's restraint in it, where there's responsibility in it, where energy is directed towards a goal where we call that energy expenditure work. So Mars is at the service of a larger structure and is not just working and moving and it's in motion for itself. So without tempering influences of other planets such as Saturn, which brings limitations, Mars is reckless, it's conflict-oriented, and its outcome is usually things that are harmful. And in extreme, Mars actually represents death in a lot of ways. It's the way our life force gets detached from our body and our being. We get disconnected from this body, gets disconnected from its consciousness. So when we are reckless These are some of the extremes that can also come with Mars. When we glorify Mars, these are some of the things that can come with it. And a glorified Mars, that glorified, if we're just constantly focusing on that drive, which represents anger, aggression, hyper independence, where's the psyche going? Where the psyche is how we're going to feel, it's how we're going to act, and hence the kinds of result that we're going to have. Glorifying Mars, and I was saying this in the Saturn video too, or glorifying Saturn or any planet, is not understanding the means and modalities of existence that are also within us. The point is, we keep gazing into Mars. Mars is a malefic. It's representing a kind of an abyss. We're risking being consumed by that nature. And if we are, we're going to lose sight on what it means to be human and to be humane. And honestly, we don't want to glorify Mars like that, and we don't want those Martian outcomes. I mean, from all the things I've read, from all the people that I've talked to, from my own life experiences, I've never heard a human being who glorifies living in war. Mars represents war. What we truly actually value is what comes after war, which is peace, or at least the desire for peace, love, and harmony, which we're talking about Venus. In fact, the wars that we fight only make sense because we're fighting to have those states of being, not just to be in war for the sake of war. So a glorification of Mars is like wanting war for the sake of having war. I love war. I just want to be at war. War is great. It's starting to sound like a certain president. War for war's sake, again, is psychotic. So I think this is going to bring us to the end of our video. And before logging off, if you guys want your own personal chart reading, links are in the description box below. And I'll be back to discuss the nodes and the implications for glorifying Rahu and Ketu, so that we can complete this series and then we can move to the problems with over-glorification of benefics. A number of you have asked for that, and I'll definitely do that. It's worth talking about. Again, these 7 drives need to be incorporated and be in balance. And for now, I'm wishing all of us wisdom in knowing when, where, and how to summon Mars. That's it for today. Sending you much love. Till next time.